Hi, everybody. This is the last week of working on poems for the semester, and we have two poems on our list for this week. One of them is called Harlem. You will actually recognize Harlem because it was part of A Raisin in the Sun. It actually was the inspiration for the title and perhaps even some of the ideas of A Raisin in the Sun. So here we go. The poem was published in 1951, about 8 years before A Raisin in the Sun was published. Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? The speaker of this poem is presumably Langston Hughes, and there's a picture of him writing to the left. Although the eye of a speaker is not present in this poem, we know that Hughes is writing it, and it almost makes it like an omniscient narrator or an objective speaker who's asking these questions, which within their asking provide kinds of answers. The situation. We have to know the title of the poem in order to really understand the situation, because the title of the poem is Harlem. That gives us the setting. Harlem is a borough in Upper Manhattan in New York City. In the time of the publication in the early 1950s, and Harlem still exists, of course, but we'll talk more about the importance of Harlem in this poem in the next couple of slides. The rest of the poem asks a question about dreams, and so we link the setting of Harlem, which was mostly inhabited by African Americans at the time. About 90% of Harlem in the 1950s was inhabited by African Americans. We link that with the topic. What happens to dreams that are deferred by African Americans? The situation. So the speaker attempts to answer the question with more questions, images, and one statement. So rather than it being a poem with a plot, like some of the others we've had, or with a definable speaker who is the eye of the poem, we have a different kind of situation here in this very brief, short poem, and even a different kind of speaker. The Harlem Renaissance, it's important to know a tiny bit of history about the Harlem Renaissance in order to know where this poem and where Langston Hughes fits in it. He, as the author of the poem, was part of a movement called the Harlem Renaissance. It occurred from around 1920 to the early 1940s. It involved the social and cultural influence of African American poetry, writing, jazz, painting, and arts of all kinds centered in Harlem, New York City. This club that's in the background called the Savoy was a very famous ballroom and club and dance hall in Harlem during that time. It closed, I believe, in the 1950s or 60s, but it was mostly run by African Americans, and sometimes whites came to dance at the dance hall, but mostly it was contemporary jazz music and African Americans dancing there. And although this poem was technically written after the Harlem Renaissance had ended, it was influenced by that movement and the idea of dreams for Black Americans, both artistically and politically. The format of the poem. It's four stanzas with varying numbers of lines per stanza. The final line can be considered its own stanza. So that one line is its own stanza because it's surrounded by white space. The opening question asks what happens to a dream deferred, and so we have to understand what the word defer means in order to understand the entire poem itself. To defer something means to postpone or put it off to another time. So what happens to a dream that's put off? There is end rhyme, although the rhythm of the poem is not quite regular, like my papa's waltz or the road not taken. We know that run and sun rhyme, meat and sweet, and load and explode, which are lines 3 and 5, 6 and 8, and 10 and 11. There are 6 answers to the question posed in line 1. However, 5 of those 6 answers are questions rather than statements, including the final one. So, what happens to the dream? He is asking. He's wondering. He doesn't know. This is a whole perhaps or maybe kind of situation. He is speculating. The narrator of the poem, the speaker of the poem, is speculating. We have 5 questions and 1 statement. Interestingly and ironically, the questions actually assert, while the assertion actually suggests, because of the word maybe. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. However, the questions assert, does it fester? Does it stink? We still don't know the answer, but it's certainly more of an assertion than using the word maybe. So we have some irony here in the format of the poem as a whole, because when you turn these things around, when you think about the irony of the poem, you think about the irony of dreams that are deferred. The whole notion of the ironic end result when you have a dream, but you just keep putting it off and putting it off, and it never comes true. Imagery in the poem. Imagery progresses from the visual to the sense of smell to the sense of taste. So we have dry up and fester. We can see a festering sore. We can see a raisin drying in the sun. We can smell the rotten meat. We can taste the syrupy sweet. All of these are food images. Why would this be important? I often thought about that, and one reason, I'm sure there are plenty of reasons, but one reason that comes to me is the fact that food is sustenance. Food is what makes us grow. Food is what makes us move forward in life. We have to have food. It's necessary. And so when these food images become something that's not sustenance anymore, we can't eat a dried up raisin. We can't eat stinking meat. We can't eat something that's crusted over. Therefore, the dream dies in the same way that we might die with the food that dries up or that festers or that stinks. So food therefore becomes ironic in the poem, in the same way we talked about irony earlier. The poem ends with an organic whole, an explosion. So we have visual, smell, taste, and then an organic whole of everything. We can hear, we can smell, we can see an explosion. And I think that progression of imagery subtly draws the reader into the poem. We see these parts and then we get to the whole. We also first see the outer nature of the dream that's deferred. So what happens to that dream? It's almost like the dream is to the side. It stinks, it festers, it dries up. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. It almost becomes inner at that point, related to the self. The statement that comes right before the explosion relates to the individual. The individual carries a heavy load, like a backpack that's too full and must be dragged around, sagging as it goes. So the movement of the poem, while it doesn't seem purposeful, really is on the poet's fault. Not on the poet's fault, by the poet's design, that he moves from these food images to an organic whole. He moves ironically from things that assert to things that question or suggest. He moves from the inner to the outer. And all of that is very important for us to be drawn into the poem and for us to understand that the poem is about the nature of the self and its relation to the dream. The explode at the end is set apart from the rest by italics. Those are purposeful and they make us pause longer and think more about that last line. What is an explosion? Of course, it's something that tears things apart with great upheaval. It is pieces that can never come together again. It's violent. Think about Walter's dream deferred in A Raisin in the Sun. The explosion at the end that really puts him on his knees in front of his family, where he is going to give up his pride to Mr. Lindner and not take the house and take the money instead. That huge explosion at the climax. But thinking of it this way, perhaps once the dream does explode, can it propel the individual forward? Is there a sense of hope in the explosion? Or does the explosion mean it can never be put back together again? Does the explosion mirror the disharmony of blacks and whites in America that continues? And this is how it all sort of comes down to a poem about race in a way, because it is titled Harlem. If it had been written by a white poet, if it had not been titled Harlem, then we might be able to talk about it in a different context. But here we talk about the poem as a poem that comments on race in America in 1951, how blacks' dreams have been deferred, how they continue to be deferred, what happens to them, and how that disharmony may continue. The explosion could actually also be referencing and foreshadowing the explosion of the civil rights movement that is starting to happen. And the civil rights movement will not come to fruition for another 15 or so years. But there's always, and I've talked about this in lectures before, always a sense in the best writers of foreshadowing and forewarning and foretelling some of the events that will happen, essentially being ahead of their time. So there's the short poem Harlem. We can see how it relates to A Raisin in the Sun, and we can now analyze it on its own, in its own accord, with historical and biographical reference, as well as close reading of the poem itself. Okay, that's all, guys. Bye-bye.